I'm Dr. Andy Kaufman, recovering physician, plandemic whistleblower, natural healing pedagogue, and legal code talker. You can call me the Truth Doctor. I'm here to shift your paradigm as I perform a radical forensic dissection, discerning fact from fiction, science from pseudoscience, medicine from poison, law from legal fiction, and individualism from collectivism. This is your channel for unraveling the truth about health and science. This is the Healthy Living Livestream. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. I want to devote today's live stream to hopefully clearing up once and for all a common myth that is portrayed out there in cyberspace about the dangers of drinking purified water. And I'm specifically talking about distilled water and reverse osmosis water, putting out the claim that it somehow leaches minerals from our body or makes us deficient in minerals. So today I'm going to explain why that is not the case. Where do we actually get minerals from and which ones do we need? How does our body regulate that? And how can we improve our health by making sure that we get enough minerals, because there certainly is a problem of mineral deficiencies. It's just that it is not related to or created by drinking purified water. So let me start by just giving you the reason why I recommend purifying water and why many people do this. So I'm going to put up this slide here. Now, this shows some of the various contaminants that are commonly found in drinking water. And this is mostly in tap water, but can be also in well water and in bottled water sources at the grocery store. Now, if we look at the top left, we see pharmaceutical drugs. Now, this is very worrisome, and there can be a variety of drugs present in the water. Think about what are the most common drugs prescribed. We have things like blood pressure medicine, birth control pills, antidepressants, sleeping pills, pain medications, right? Just to name a few. So obviously, even in small amounts, these substances can cause problems for us. Now, we also have contamination with heavy metals, which could include lead, barium, arsenic, and a chromium isotope. We do need chromium in our body, but there's another form of chromium that's very toxic to us. So besides heavy metals, we have volatile organic compounds. We have agricultural chemicals, including herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers that are present from runoff into the wastewater system or into contaminating our drinking supply. And of course, these toxins promote microorganism growth in the water, which can also be present and indicates the presence of other toxins. Okay, so I didn't give an exhaustive list, but let me say that the water that comes out of your tap, wherever it comes from, in order to know if any of these types of contaminants are present, you need to conduct specific testing of that water. But I can safely say that if it comes to tap water that is from a public supply or a municipal supply, that it will definitely contain many of these toxic substances. And that is the reason why it's important to purify your water to reduce your exposure. Now, there are some natural sources of water, such as springs, especially springs that spontaneously come through the ground, that may, in fact, be a source of pure water that needs no further purification. But The only way to know this is to have it tested, because even springs can sometimes merge with aquifers that contain groundwater that is already contaminated, that leaches down and mixes with the spring water. So in order to be certain, you definitely need to test your specific water source, or simply use one of the applicable purification methods. And I'll discuss two methods that adequately remove all of these substances and essentially give you almost 100% pure water. And for a specific device, I encourage you to review the specific testing results from the manufacturer. There are also government standards for water purification, for reverse osmosis, for example, that you can learn about. Distillation is a little bit less dependent on the device, and I'll explain in a moment. But this is a diagram of a typical reverse osmosis system, and it explains how it's organized, that there are pre-filters for the water that's going into it, the so-called contaminated water, like a sediment filter and activated carbon filters that can remove particles and some of the burden of contaminants. And then it is passed through a reverse osmosis membrane, where the water can leave those contaminants behind and go into another chamber across a membrane, where that is now the pure water that comes out of the tap or exits the filter for your drinking. And the other method that can achieve this is distillation. And distillation is interestingly comes from alchemy before chemistry, and it's a way of purifying liquids. So any liquid can be distilled, and it's based upon utilizing the unique boiling point of different liquids. And so it can separate mixtures of liquids from each other, and also any dissolved solids in the liquid will be left behind in the vessel after the water or other liquid evaporates or boils off. And then the pure water vapor goes through a condenser, where it is cooled, usually with cold water, sometimes just air, and it recondenses into liquid water and then drips into your vessel at the end, and where you have the purified distilled water. Now, there are commercial products that you can find to conduct these in your home. So there are reverse osmosis filters from several companies that you can install under your sink and have a special faucet where the pure water comes out, which is very convenient to have running water. There are also countertop reverse osmosis filtration systems where it will fill up a carafe with the purified water. And there are also obviously distillation devices. Of course, you could do this just with some glassware that you buy online, but there are self-contained devices that are similar to large coffee makers and will fill up usually like a 1 gallon size carafe with distilled water after several hours of running. So we have this purified water now after going through these processes. And in order to understand how this affects the minerals in your body, I'm going to take the slides off for a minute and talk about osmosis, okay? Because osmosis is a very important process. Obviously, it's involved in a reverse osmosis filter, as I just described, but osmosis is the principal way that your body absorbs water through your gastrointestinal tract. And so what osmosis is, it is kind of a special situation where you have water and what are known as solutes. So water is often called the universal solvent because it dissolves things very readily. And the things it dissolves are called solutes. So these can be, a number of commonly known substances like sugar, for example. We know that we can put sugar in water and stir it and it will dissolve. Or salts of various types dissolve in water, and those represent the minerals in our body, because minerals and salts are essentially referring to the same thing, which is metals. Okay. Now, the situation arises where we have a membrane or a divider that solutes, okay, the things dissolved in the water, can't go across. Now, this can be created artificially in a laboratory with various types of membranes, like in your reverse osmosis filter, but this naturally occurs inside of your intestines. And it is what's known as the basement membrane, or essentially the border of the tissue that contains this type of membrane. So when you drink water, it goes into the inside of your intestines, known as the lumen. And then in order to get absorbed into the body, it has to cross this membrane, which is semi-permeable. So water can pass through this membrane, but the solutes cannot. So the salt or the sugar, for example. Now, there are ways that the body absorbs the salts and the sugars, but we're just talking about the water here. So essentially what happens is that the water will move across that membrane to wherever the most solutes are, okay? Or it'll move from where the most water is to the least water, if you want to look at it that way. But for me, it's much easier to understand as the water is trying to dissolve solutes, so it's going to where they are. Now, here is the situation of what is going on both sides of that membrane. And we use this term of osmolality to describe pretty much how much solutes are in the fluid. So the more solutes there are, the higher the osmolality, and the units are milliosms per liter. And the lower the amount of solutes there are, the lower the osmolality. So if we look at physiologic fluid, in other words, what's on the intestine side of the basement membrane, our body fluids are 300 milliosms per liter. Okay, the osmolality is 300. Now, when we talk about drinking water, if it's purified water, then the osmolality would be essentially 0. So there are no solutes in the water we drink, but there are 300 milliosms of solutes on the other side of the membrane. So the water will readily go from where it's pure to where the solutes are and be absorbed across the membrane readily. Okay, now in the case where we have, let's say, a beverage that has some solutes in it, so not purified distilled water, there are different categories, and you can think about this with respect to the osmolality of what the intestine is or what our body is, which is that 300 number. So if it's more than 0 but less than 300, it's what's called a hypotonic solution. It has less solutes than our body. Hypo means lower, and tonicity has to do with the osmolality. It's a similar kind of term. Now, if we drink something that's 300, the same exact osmolality as our body, then that's called an isotonic drink. And if we drink something that has more solutes than our body, we have a hyperosmolar or hypertonic beverage. Now, since the water, as we remember, moves to where there are more solutes, if we have a hypotonic beverage, then the water will get absorbed across the membrane. If it is isotonic, then there is no net flow. But in that case, water does get absorbed into the body, because what happens is that the body actively absorbs many of those solutes in the isotonic beverage, like the salts, sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, for example. And then the water in the lumen now has fewer solutes because they got sucked up into the body. So now osmosis can occur and the water can be absorbed following the solutes, essentially. But the situation is a little different when we drink a hypertonic solution, which has more solutes, right? And especially if it has many more solutes than the body, this water will not all be absorbed and can produce diarrhea. And this is essentially a strategic approach that's used by doctors for a bowel prep. where they give you a hypertonic solution to drink. This is normally a solution of polyethylene glycol that you drink large volumes of, and it makes you have massive diarrhea to clean out your bowel so that they can do a procedure and see clearly. You can also achieve this by doing what's known as saltwater flushes, where you have a hypertonic salt solution, something like seawater, and drink that, and it will also cause you to have diarrhea and flush that out. So we can see from how the body absorbs water that the more dilute the water is that you swallow, the more readily your body will be able to absorb it through osmosis. But as I said, there's also the active absorption of minerals, which lowers the concentration in the fluid you drink and allows water to be absorbed, even if there are solutes, as long as it is not a hypertonic solution. Okay, so we can see that if we drink distilled or reverse osmosis water, we will have no problem whatsoever absorbing the water. And there are actually studies that have been done that show this by invasively measuring how much water is absorbed. And overall, our ability to absorb water in the intestine is extremely impressive. So most people drink 1 to 2 liters of water a day, and they're able to absorb more than 98% of that water. Only a very tiny amount comes out in the stool. But what's even more impressive is that there are roughly about 9 liters of secretions in the gut, right, that come from the gastric juices, the saliva, the pancreatic juices, and bile from the liver. So all these sources represent approximately 4.5 times more water than we drink, and our body still absorbs almost all of that water. So only a very tiny fraction comes out in the stool, provided everything is working well and we don't have diarrhea, which represents too much water inside the lumen of the gut, or constipation, which represents too little water inside of the gut, or at least that is one way to look at it. So we can see here that absorption is definitely not an issue in terms of purified water. So let's talk about the minerals and the potential of mineral leaching. So we can see that when we drink purified water in the gut, there's no leaching of minerals through the gut, right? Because all that's happening is that pure water is coming in and then it's getting absorbed by osmosis into the body. Of course, pure water doesn't add any minerals to the body, it only adds water. Now, someone who doesn't fully understand how the body regulates minerals could think that this would overall dilute the concentration of minerals in the body, and that is the problem. However, we don't see any evidence that this occurs because the body maintains those concentrations very carefully. But of course, we do lose minerals over time. We lose them, in our urine. We lose them, well, the only way we lose them in the stool is when we have abnormal, physiology or a disease, but we lose them in the sweat as well. So we definitely need to replenish minerals in our body, but do they actually come from the water, or where do they come from? Now, before I tell you the answers to that, I just want to further define what I'm talking about here with minerals, because I like to divide minerals, nutritive minerals, into 2 categories. So one is the macro minerals, and these are metals that our body needs in relatively large amounts. And you're probably most familiar with these minerals in the body, sodium being the most prevalent, chloride, which is generally the counter ion of sodium, but potassium, magnesium, calcium, and phosphorus. Those are the ones that we definitely need in the largest amounts, and I refer to those as macro minerals. But then we also have what's referred to as trace minerals usually, or micro minerals. And those are a bit less characterized, but something that I have learned about, and there is no consensus on exactly how many of these trace mineral substances we need, but they are very valuable for our body's functioning. And they would include metals like copper, zinc, which you probably are more familiar with, but also things like manganese, molybdenum, and even more exotic things like europium may all be required in very, very small amounts. So I don't think there's anyone claiming that there is a full complement of trace minerals in drinking water, and that there must be another source that we get those from our food. So we're going to mostly talk about macro minerals, because that's what most people are referring to when they make this claim about drinking distilled water. So we're talking then, just to remind you, about sodium, calcium, magnesium, and potassium predominantly. So let me bring up the slides again, and let's just look at some data. So there's one study I found where they looked at different types of mineral water and looked at the osmolality. And they broke it down into 3 categories depending on the level of minerals in the mineral water. And we can see in the low mineralization, we had osmolalities in the 20s. It was sort of in the 50s in the medium, and then between 50 and a little over 100 in the high category. So all of these cases, we can see that mineral water, one, is hypotonic to the body, because all of those numbers are far less than 300. And when we're talking about a lot of the mineral water has very, very little amount of solutes and is not that far off from distilled water. So if we say the osmolality of distilled water is 0, and then we have mineral water that only has 20 compared to the body's 300, we can see that the difference between 0 and 20 is far less than the difference between 20 and 300. So we have similar absorption of the water with these, and then we have some small amount of minerals that will also be absorbed by the body in these mineral waters. But does this amount relate to anything near what our body actually requires? So in order to look more closely at that, we have this data on tap water, and it also includes some mineral waters, but this looks at specific amounts of the particular minerals in these different water sources and compares them to the daily requirements, which is definitely open to debate, but that's a separate subject, of people at various stages in their lives. And we can see, if we look at these categories, that the various waters don't, with the only one exception, don't have anywhere near the amount of minerals that we require. And these numbers for the water represent a full liter of water. So, for example, if you wanted to take a typical tap water and try to get the amount you would need as an adult of calcium, right? The mean amount of calcium in a liter of tap water is 34 milligrams. And we would need 1,000 milligrams per day. So you could see that this is, we'd have to drink way more than 10 liters of water, which would be impossible and unhealthy in order to get enough calcium. And you can see that the ranges for magnesium and sodium are from 0 to a relatively small amount as well. So if you don't know the specific amounts of your water, it could likely be that there are actually as little as none of these minerals in the water. Now, there are a little bit more when we get into moderate mineralization waters, but still not really enough to meet your supply. Okay, so let's, just for comparative sake here, look at the level of minerals in food. Now, this is looking at various plant foods, and this is only 100 grams of the particular food item, which is, certainly far less than you might eat if you made a meal out of this food item. For example, 100-gram tomato is one medium tomato. Now, if you were, not saying you would do this, but if you made a meal completely out of tomatoes, you would certainly eat many more than just one. But even one of these tomatoes has more than about 15% of the daily requirement for calcium. So you can see that this is much, much higher amounts. And you have to look at particular foods to see which has the most. Like, for example, beans tend to have the highest amounts of calcium specifically, but for potassium, tomatoes are actually higher in potassium. So we can see that if we look at plant foods, we find much higher amounts of minerals. Now, whether all these minerals are bioavailable or not is a different question that we're not going to look at today, but it's something worth considering. And here is a table looking at the amount of some of these minerals in beef. And this is looking at milligrams per kilogram of beef. And we can see that now, while the calcium level is not that impressive, the other minerals are in much higher amounts, certainly compared to the various types of water. And we know that, the one animal source of calcium that is very high is milk and dairy products. And for example, in just one glass of milk, you get 300 milligrams roughly of calcium, which is a third of the daily, a quarter to a third of the daily supply. So you certainly can get these minerals much more from the food you eat than the water you drink. And I'll remind you that the tap water that most people would consider drinking would not just have the minerals that your body wants, but have other minerals which are toxic to the body. And of course, they wouldn't be absorbed as readily in the gut, but they would still give you some exposure. So we've kind of looked at one side of the story, which is where does the body, or where do we get our minerals from? But also how does our body regulate the minerals? Well, there are very sophisticated homeostatic mechanisms our body uses to make sure that we have the right amount of minerals, in the right places, because there'll be mineral concentrations inside our cells, outside the cells, in the extracellular space, in the blood and the vascular space, and in various other fluids and compartments in the body. So there can be a very, sophisticated regulatory system. But that regulatory system also allows our body to balance these things effectively without becoming deficient and losing function. So, for example, with respect to calcium, of course, we get calcium from our food and absorb it into the body quite regularly, and then it might be stored or utilized in the body in various compartments. But if we have a deficit of calcium, our body can conserve it and even bring more into the blood, for example, by reabsorbing or resorbing some of our bone, or mineralized bone, shrinking the bones, but allowing enough calcium to serve other functions in the body. And also our gut and kidneys can help preserve calcium. So the kidneys will reabsorb any calcium from the urine so that the urine that comes out doesn't get rid of any calcium when we're short on it. And our body also will increase the calcium absorption in the gut, so that if we eat food that has even a trace of calcium, it will get in our body to correct this deficiency. And we have very similar systems for the other important macro minerals that we need to keep in tight ranges. So if we, for example, drink pure water, and to excess, that we have now, too much water in the body, and it would dilute these minerals to a level that's too low, our body can simply get rid of pure water, right? This can happen in the kidneys very readily, where it can dilute the urine and reabsorb or prevent secretion of all of the minerals that we need. So there's really no mechanism that I found that could potentially cause our body to quote unquote leach minerals by adding more pure water to the system. And in fact, even if we're drinking tap water or mineral water for the most part, it is going to be very, very hypotonic and have a very similar level of solutes to pure water, which is none. So none or a very little bit. And there's really not a big difference, and that is not going to affect the overall content of our body's minerals. So in conclusion, I hope that this is adequate for you to not worry any longer about drinking purified water, whether it be distilled or purified by reverse osmosis, that it will not affect the level of minerals in your body. And you may still be deficient in minerals because of poor nutrition, not eating the right foods or foods that have the right things that you can absorb the nutrients. So certainly improve your diet to get the right macro minerals. Now, micro minerals or trace minerals are almost impossible to get from the food supply because they have been essentially taken out of the food supply through modern food production. So you do need to have some additional source of trace minerals in order to have enough of those minerals in your body, but they don't come from water either. So I would recommend a product like fulvic minerals, or even better, shilajit, which is from plants that decayed, and that is certainly available on my website, where I have a very high quality version of it. With respect to replenishing macro minerals, there is a very enriched source of macro minerals that's very convenient to use, which is molasses. So molasses is the substance left behind from the sugar cane when they process out the sugar. Now, molasses may still contain some sugar, and I recommend that you search around for the lowest sugar versions of molasses, but 1 to 2 tablespoons of molasses in a glass of water will provide substantial minerals like potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sodium. So there you have some action items to replenish your minerals and the truth on distilled and reverse osmosis water. It's been a pleasure to deliver this material, and I would be happy to take a few questions at this time. All right. Mina Tokar asks, can you recommend a portable water bottle filter? I really am not a big fan of this type of technology. I did experiment with it one time based on the recommendations of Dr. Jennifer Daniels when I went on a trip. But what I found is that I essentially nearly ruptured an aneurysm in my head trying to suck the water through the filter. So if it's a gravity-based filter system, it may be successful, but always when you're evaluating a water purification technology, you have to look at the testing data to know for sure if it's successful. What I do for travel, especially if I go to other countries where the water supply is even more dangerous than the United States, is I bring a distiller with me. It fits in one of those carry-on size suitcases. I use the Mega Home distiller, which does a gallon at a time. And it is slightly inconvenient, of course, but it does the job. And I really don't mind traveling with it because the peace of mind that I have clean water, that I will not end up sick during my travels, is well worth it. And I've been to Mexico and I've seen my peers one by one get struck with a diarrheal illness, and I was, of course, 100% totally fine. All right. Vicky asks, I live in the country and drink water from a deep well. I wonder if I had a power outage, could I get water from a large river nearby and distill it? Would it be pure to drink? Well, of course, if you distill it, it will be pure. And you can, do a number of things to prepare for this event if it would really happen. One is you can have a manual pump for your well as a backup. You can also have a backup generator for that system. And let me also say that, unless you're drinking clearly contaminated water, like if that's a heavily polluted river, which you should be able to find out about, but drinking water for a short period of time, even if it's not the best, is very low risk. Now, if it's contaminated with sewage or something like that, you can get an acute illness, but I don't think you would risk life-threatening illness. But you certainly would if you were severely dehydrated. So it's always important in a emergency situation to balance those things. And this is why I think it's a good idea to have some kind of backup plan. Also, there are gravity filters that may be adequate, especially in an emergency situation. And you can even make your own for rainwater by putting different types of filtering substrates in a barrel. And there are lots of good plans and instructions of how to do that out on the internet. All right. Ezoro asks, how does quartz glass tube filled with full spectrum coherent water help to improve the structure of water? Well, this is a little bit off topic, and I imagine you're probably referring to the Analemma water wand, which can help structure the water. And the reason why the quartz is necessary is because the coherent energy of the water that is passed from the mother water inside the wand to the water that you're trying to structure in the vessel will not conduct through certain media like glass, but it will conduct across crystalline quartz. And that's why quartz is used. And I believe that was, determined experimentally rather than theoretically. All right. I have time for one or two more questions. Kay Stratton asks, do I need to take more Shilajit if I'm breastfeeding? Also, how do you recommend getting young children to take Shilajit? Well, yes, the answer is, of course, when you're breastfeeding and you're supplying nutrition, made by your body to your child, which is an amazing thing to do, you definitely need more of all kinds of nutrients. And even in one of the charts that I presented where there was an asterisk for the amount of calcium and other substances that said, during pregnancy, larger amounts are required. So I would maybe increase the dose by approximately 25 to 50% during the time that you're nursing, and then you can go back down to regular levels after that. Now, with respect to children, I find that the easiest way to get them to take Shilajit is to simply put it in their food. And there are a lot of types of food where you can't even detect that it's there, soups, sauces, certain beverages. Think about things that have a savory type of taste profile. If you put Shilajit in anything tomato-based, for example, the flavor will be completely masked, and it'll be very easy for your kids to drink it. You can even, make a special beverage for them where maybe you mix a little bit of juice in with the water, and then just put the Shilajit in there, and they won't really notice it if they have a little bit of sweetness on their tongue. All right, let's take one more question from. Now, this isn't Tony Blair, the former prime minister here. They say distilled water is negatively charged and attracts inorganic materials. Well, so obviously, when you have pure water, water likes to dissolve things. So whatever it comes in contact with, if it's soluble at all in water, it will absorb it in the water. But if you keep the distilled water in a vessel, it's not going to be, exposed to materials that would contaminate it. Now, the negative charge is actually interesting, and what you would have here is the opposite. So, and that's because when you distill water or run it through a RO filter, the resulting pure water is going to be slightly acidic, which means it has an excess of protons or positive charges. So distilled water will be slightly positively charged, whereas neutral water will not be charged. and water that is alkaline will actually be negative charged because of an excess of the hydroxide ions, or OH minus. All right. Well, once again, very stimulating and good questions from the audience. I really appreciate that. And I hope this, once again, clears up any misunderstanding about the safety of distilled water. I look forward to seeing everyone next week for another Healthy Living live stream.